Welcome. My name is Coleman Pratt. This is Keeping Guard. If you're new here, I established Keeping Guard for the purpose of helping equip and encourage pastors and ministry leaders to fulfill their call with integrity, joy, purpose, and faithfulness. I do that a couple of different ways. One is through conversations. You can reach out to me on the email that is provided. Maybe for a one-time conversation, you just kind of want to talk through something that's going on in your ministry or in your life. Or if you're interested in more of a like coaching or mentoring relationship, connect with me and we can talk about what that looks like going forward. The other way is through videos just like this. I post these on my website here, keepingguard.org, under the Sermon Corner and the Pastor's Corner, to help pastors and ministry leaders. Currently, under the Sermon Corner, I'm in the midst of a series I have entitled Face to Face, Steps to Intimacy with God, Reflections on the Life of Moses. Now, in these that I'm posting under the Sermon Corner, they're not full-blown sermons. They're just kind of ideas that I'm hoping that can ignite maybe a direction for you with an upcoming sermon or Bible study that you can just kind of flesh out and make it your own. You know, God uses language about Moses that he uses about no one else in Scripture. When he says, there's not been a prophet arisen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. So I'm just kind of walking through what were some of the things that were a part of Moses' life, steps, if you will, that could lead God to make such a statement of intimacy in his relationship with his servant. I've gone through 3 steps already. First was the favor that God extended, recognizing that a relationship of intimacy always is initiated by God. Second was the failure that Moses experienced there in Egypt when he took matters into his own hands and killed the Egyptian. That matter became known and he fled to Midian. But that failure became an integral part of the progression of Moses' relationship with God. Third was the faithfulness that Moses exercised there at the well in Midian, the end of chapter 2 of Exodus, as he stepped in and interceded for Jethro's daughters who were at the well and being treated roughly and rudely by a group of shepherds. Today is step number 4, and I am simply calling this the fear that Moses encountered from Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. And in talking about the fear that Moses encountered, it is important to recognize, I think, in our relationship with God, that is going to be a component of drawing near and an intimacy with God. That what Moses encountered, oftentimes, most times, we're going to encounter as well, but it is appropriate fear. It is even necessary fear as God encounters us in much the same way sometimes as he encountered Moses. Now we know in Exodus chapter 3, that's the famous burning bush, but before we get to what I'm just simply going to reflect on 4 things that Moses realized that brought this fear into his life, I want to just kind of camp for a moment on verse 1, because coming out of chapter 2 and here in chapter 3, verse 1, we find Moses, as some people have said, on the backside of a desert, having spent about 40 years there watching his father-in-law's sheep. And I can imagine that Moses was dealing with significant feelings of failure, of irrelevance, of insignificance. And yet we find in verse 1 that as Moses is simply doing his daily duty of watching the sheep, he comes to the mount called Horeb, which is identified as the mountain of God. And it was there that God encountered Moses. And what is, I think, encouraging, at least it is to me, I hope it is to you and will be to your people, is that at that point of maybe Moses' greatest sense of failure, he found out that he was exactly where God wanted him to be. Maybe today you're experiencing some similar thoughts, struggling with feeling like a failure. Certainly some of your people are. And how important it is for you and for me to realize and for our people to understand that place, as I like to say, oftentimes the address of God is found at the end of our rope. Moses, at that place of failure, was exactly where God wanted him to be. And in this encounter, 4 things that Moses encountered that prompted fear. It says that Moses was afraid. What are they? Number 1, it is God revealed who God is. Number 1 is who God is. Moses encountered the real God. As far as we know, it's the first personal encounter that Moses had with God. And at this encounter, God reveals himself, first of all, as holy, completely separate and holy. There at that burning bush, he tells Moses to remove his sandals, for the ground on which he is standing is holy ground. Moses, like you and me and the people that we lead and preach and teach to each and every week, need to understand the holiness of God. That God is to be revered. He is an awesome God. Much like we are told in the New Testament about working our salvation out with fear and trembling. It's an important component of an intimate relationship with God. But in this revelation of himself, God also reveals that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So important that God reveals not only himself as holy, but also as a faithful, covenant-keeping God, a promise-keeping God. How important that is, or how important that was for Moses to learn and understand. How important it is for us and for our people. Second thing that Moses encountered was not just who God is, but Moses encountered, secondly, who he was. Who am I? Moses said later on in that text, down about verse 11. Who am I? Boy, isn't that an important understanding revelation? As we recognize and begin to understand who God is, the natural question is, who am I? And yet, what I believe God wanted Moses to understand, and what he wants us to understand and to communicate to our people, is that we are not only his children, but that we, as God's children, are caught up into his larger story. God identified himself to Moses as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I think part of the reason for that is that God wanted Moses to understand that his smaller story was part of a much larger, ancient story. That he was the God of the famous patriarchs that he had made covenant promises to, and that this same God was Moses' God. And the God who had made those promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would keep them in Moses' life. Man, it is an overwhelming realization, but also an incredibly exciting and encouraging one when we begin to understand and catch a glimpse of the larger story of God. Our story is caught up into his story. And God is always telling his story. He's not telling my story. He's not telling the story of the people we lead. He's telling his story. But in telling his story, he invites us to be a part of his larger, bigger story. Third, what Moses encountered was not just who God is, not just who he was or who I am. He also encountered what God sees. There, God reveals to Moses that he sees three things. First of all, he sees the people that he loves. Israel, the nation that he had formed and called out. He sees the people that he loves. You know, so oftentimes we miss people. We talk a lot of times about being our people blindness. We sometimes see people as irritants, problems. But God sees people that he loves. And he was sharing with Moses the vision that he had. He sees God, he sees the people that he loves. But secondly, what God sees, he sees the pain of their oppression. He sees their slavery. He sees their bondage. He sees the things that are breaking and crushing their lives. How important it was for Moses to be able to see that as well. And third, what God sees is that God sees the promise that he has given. And when I say that he sees it, he remembered. He wanted Moses to know that he remembered that. He wanted Moses to remember that as well. So Moses encountered who God is, who he was, what God sees, but then finally, and maybe where the rubber meets the road, is when Moses encountered what God planned. Because it's one thing to see what God sees, but I think it was maybe an entirely different thing for God to say to Moses, all right, I'm going to partner now with you in the solution for my people. Can you imagine the overwhelming sense, that fear that Moses must have had when God said to Moses, I'm sending you? When we encounter what God's plan is, we are right to be overwhelmed, even fearful. But when God spoke to Moses, he spoke into that fear with three truths that I believe he wanted Moses to build as the foundation of his life going forward. First, God wanted Moses to know, I am the one sending you. You're not doing this on your own. You're not going on your own. I am the one sending you. It's important for us and for our people to have that sense that when we are involved in what God is doing, that we are there because God is the one who has called us there or sent us there. Second, God wanted Moses to know, hey, listen, I am going to be with you. In other words, I am sufficient for everything I'm calling you to do, everything I'm sending you to do. I am sufficient. I will be with you, God tells Moses. And third, God says to Moses, I'm going to show up, Moses. He talks about signs, giving a sign when Moses brings the people out. He says, I'm going to show up. When we step out to the places where God calls us and sends us, we go with his presence, but we also go with the assurance, hey, God's going to show up. Now, it might look different. It looked different to Moses than maybe what Moses could have possibly anticipated. God didn't tell Moses everything that was going to happen for good reason, because that would have been beyond overwhelming. That would have crushed him. But he did promise Moses that he's going to show up. And he promises that to me. He promises that to you. He promises that to our people. And in the midst of an encounter that produced appropriate fear, it is the presence and the promise of God that allows us to move forward in faith and in trust to our God. So there you have it. Step number 4, the fear that Moses encountered. An important step into an intimate relationship with God. As he encountered who God was, who he was, what God saw, and then what God planned. Pastor, ministry leader, listen, I hope your life is going well, your ministry is going well, your family is going well. And reach out to me. Let me know how I can be praying for you. If you want to have a conversation, contact me, as I said on that email. Thanks so much for joining me today, and we'll talk soon. All right, bye-bye.